From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by Square. If you're an Android developer, you've most likely already heard of Square from the amazing open source Android libraries they've released. But we sometimes forget that Square is actually one of the best payment services companies. In this episode, they'd like you to know that you can build with Square's in-app payments SDK for Android for a secure and managed way to take payments. It enables mobile apps because, you and I work on mobile apps. If you want a really nice and easy way to accept credit cards on the Square platform with a really nice pre-built slick UI, then the in-app payments SDK just does that right out of the bat. In the US, it also makes it possible to accept Google Pay and Apple Pay. I don't know about you folks, but these days I completely almost always rely on Apple Pay and Google Pay. You can learn more about the in-app payments SDK for Android and Square's other payments and commerce APIs and SDKs at youtube.com/squaredev. I love that instead of doing boring old documentation, they also provide this alternative channel because these days some of the best ways to actually see how to demonstrate or find a tutorial to use an SDK is just to show that through YouTube. And Square does exactly just that. Thank you so much to Square for sponsoring today's show. And once again, you can go and check out their in-app payments SDK and actually go and look at the tutorial at youtube.com/squaredev. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Square.
Kaushik, what's going on, man?
Nothing much. I think today we want to pick up on another topic.
Definitely. This is a topic that I think we actually discussed a few times, but we never actually dove into it. And that topic is logging.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought this up just recently again because I was doing a bunch of Android work, and in Android, I'll typically use something like Timber, which we'll get into in a second what that is, for logging. But then I was doing some stuff over in React and in Node, and I started wondering, all right, well, what's the best way to log over here? And then I started thinking about, what should I be logging? Should I use the default logging tools? Like if I'm Android, do I use log.d for debug and log.w for warn? Okay, but then do I want these in my production build, or how do I do that? And that's where things like Timber come in and different languages. And it just started making me think about logging in general. What should we be logging? Are there any tips or tricks that we can share with the listeners out there of what we've accomplished in the past to help with logging your applications? And just kind of wanted to bring it up with you.
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary. It is also very interesting. I think logging in general can be extremely useful, especially when you need it. But there are so many nuances to it, right? Like you said, what do you log? Which I think is, again, a very important aspect today where we have GDPR on the side of Europe. And also, if you're in California, we also have the California Privacy Act, CPA something, which is very similar to GDPR. So there's aspects of logging where you want to make sure you protect people's privacy too. So you can't log everything. But at the same time, you want to also maybe log enough. So it's useful for you as a programmer. And like you said, right, between production and debug builds, if you have a debug build running and you want to dump a whole bunch of logs, then how do you manage that versus the alternative? And even if you're in production, I can speak out of some experience I've had, especially at Instacart, where we have a lot of shoppers, and sometimes we run into really bizarre issues with different kinds of phones. How we try to manage that, I don't necessarily know if I have the best or recommended way of logging. I don't know if such a thing exists, but I mean, I can talk about some of the things that we do that I found helpful. And, as always, I'm pretty sure as we get into the topic, it'll be interesting to see what you have come across through your experience.
Yeah, definitely. Before we get into the nitty gritty details of some production level logging for some heavy duty apps that you and I have worked on, let's talk a little bit about different types of logging and when we might want to use them. So let's just go with the default Android ones that a lot of our listeners are familiar with. We have, log.d, which I think is probably the most common, which is, debug, and then we have W for warn, E for error. I think is it I for info or is it V
That's
for
right.
verbose?
V's verbose. So actually,
I
these are like
rarely
the
use it.
priority levels, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you start moving up from the priority levels, I think it starts at verbose, which is basically the most well, not noisy, but like the most comprehensive in terms of like logging everything, right? Like, oh, this
Yeah.
happened, and I think that's also interesting because even I think like this is something that over time has been tricky for me, as also like with a lot of the teams that I've worked on, like the understanding of what is marked in these priorities. So we'll get into that shortly. But I think it's verbose, debug, warn. Debug is debug. Warn is warning, error, and in some cases there's I missed info, I guess, right? So there's info, and in some cases there's also critical. So uh, those are like I think the six. But you were mentioning the ones that are with Android, right? Like the base priority levels. I think other
Yeah.
than critical, we covered the other ones.
You forgot one.
Oh, the interesting one. There's a story behind that. That's the one, right? The
Yeah, there's one.
WTF one.
Yeah, there's actually an Android. There's one called log.wtf, and it stands for what a terrible failure. It's when you report a condition that should never happen. So
Right.
can't say I've really used it, but it's always an interesting log statement. But yeah, so like let's talk quickly. Just kind of talk about. Let me ask you, what is your take on when do you typically use each one of these levels of logging? Is it when do you use the verbose versus info, debug, error, warning, etc. Do you have any like heuristics you kind of follow?
And this has changed over time, obviously, like because as I've moved from working from an extremely small app to like a much larger app, like a lot of these things have changed over time. But I can like go through what I think about like the priority levels in themselves. And
Hmm.
once we talk about how these are like actually logged or how they are sent to a point of consumption, it also changes. So I think that's where it makes it interesting. But at least for me, the way I've started, and again, right now, this context is in mobile applications that are logging, right? I know it's
Hmm.
like a little different when you have backend applications or like where you want to log there. But I think right now we're talking about client side applications, right?
Hmm. Yes. Hmm.
Where this is a user, like someone who's like using your service, uh, that, where you want to draw logs from. Typically for verbose, the priority level verbose, the way I go about it is this is information that I wouldn't necessarily want streamed or like sent directly to a streamed logging
Hmm.
service. Uh, there are like logging services that actually like where you can stream logs, right? There are like different ones like Log DNA. There was Logly, I
Yeah.
think. There's also one that we kind of use, which is not exactly logging, but is similar-ish, called
Yeah.
Datadog. There's a lot of these great
There's a
services out
ton
there,
of
and I
them.
swear by these services. Yeah, and like they're great. They can get a little pricey, but again, it it's the scope of your application, right? If you're working on a production application where it's extremely critical for you to be able to solve things quickly and find out issues, debug issues, and you're able to spend the
Hmm.
money, then these I totally vouch by these services. I think they're great. So anyway, verbose is typically what I log in verbose. I don't expect that to be available directly as a streamed log, but I do log those locally on the client. And I'll talk about this. This is like just interesting information. Like the screen was presented, and this call was made or that call was made. This network request was
Hmm.
made with these headers. Like all that goes into verbose. Uh, Debug, my debug logs are logs that I'm like truly using for debugging, right? Like, and the way I use this personally is if I'm releasing a new feature and like it's a feature that I'm not yet sure works extremely stably, or like there are things I want to know about how this feature works, then I use debug. And the understanding is these debug logs get streamed to a
Hmm.
backend, right? So like these services that I talk about, like anything that goes into debug goes into these services. So I obviously also have to be careful. I can't just like log anything I want there. But the way I kind of do it is as I'm rolling out a feature, I put these in debug, and I actually also in future file like we use Jira in our system here. I file a Jira ticket that says by date X, like turn these debug logs back to verbose. Once I know with some level, once I have a certain level of confidence that these features are working the way they're supposed to, then I change the priority from debug to verbose. So those are the kind of things that I would put in debug. Info is like useful information that I would need to know at all points of time, right? For example, I think I put I can't remember, but any screen load, like if a new activity is loading or like a new screen in quotes is loading to a user, then I put that in the info
Okay.
priority, right? And this is the kind of information where I think if you think about wanting to leave breadcrumbs in your app, like say if you were to look through your app and like just want to know like what is happening, right? Like say you got a new order is placed if you're like, in a marketplace, or like, in a new screen, a very specific feature was like activated, like there was a payment call made or something, obviously again, all with like masked for
Mm-hmm.
privacy. The important milestones in the flow of your app, these are what I would put behind
Mm-hmm.
info. What's the next one? Yeah, warning. So like with warnings, basically, I don't know if this is the right approach, but it's worked pretty well. Anything that's a non-fatal
Yeah.
error, so these are caught exceptions, I just put them in warning. So like if you have try in the old like days, if you have a try catch, actually even in the new days, if you have a try catch call, things that are caught, right? I put that. Or like if you're in the land of RX Java and you have an on error call, all those go into like warning. Those are things that, hey, this should not have happened, but I'm handling, in quote unquote, handling this in some way. So that's why I think of these as like non-fatal errors. Uh, Crashes, like, true crashes, those go into the next priority level, which is error.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the other one? So there's critical, which is a little different. Critical is I actually like, and these, it depends on the services you use. Like there is a priority level where if it's a critical thing that I've logged, this page is an engineer. Like that's how I think about it. So this is so bad that you need to wake someone up, like, who's on call and let them know this happened. That's a critical. And there are very few of these
And
critical. Like we don't
that's
actually have,
something you've got.
yeah.
I mean, I guess so we've got these. I guess what I'm trying to say is if I'm taking this
Mm-hmm.
look at this from an Android developer perspective, and I'm only if I've ever used just the log class. Now you have talked.
Yeah, then you probably
Yeah, so we
wouldn't.
don't have
Yeah.
critical
Mm-hmm.
inside of there. So I think that kind of takes us to like to the next step. And
Mm-hmm.
just so everyone is aware, I really don't have much to add to what you're saying because I kind of do almost
Yeah.
exactly what you do for the
Yeah,
debugging.
I was going to follow up. Is that something that, do you also
Yeah,
adopt sort of a similar
yeah, I
strategy?
did.
Or
And
yeah.
for very early on, to tell you the truth, I did mostly everything was in 80% was in debug, and then, but the
Mm,
same thing that I've had with the warning and error, almost exactly. Like if it's caught exception, it's warned. If it's
mm,
it's an exception that shouldn't have happened, and we need to know about it, then I'll log it to error, um, and then so forth. There's just some other wrappers around that, which I think kind of gets to the next topic of like, all right, log.v, the basic log class in Android, for example, works fine. And most of the logging
mm,
utilities, if you're using Winston and JavaScript, or if you're using some other logging in Ruby or whatever, they all have a very similar kind of method signature. You can do verbose, debug, information, warning, and
mm,
error. Usually are your main ones, give or take one or two. But what you were saying earlier was something that was very interesting. Is you will then, if it's debug log, you'll stream those logs to another service. So, but
mm.
based on my experience, I know that that probably means you have some type of wrapper around a logging library, or how are you doing it? How are you using the default log class? Are you using your own custom implementation, or what does that look like? Is there an open source library you use?
This is where I think we get into Timber
Okay.
for like most Android developers. I think Timber is like by
Yeah.
Jake Wharton, and this is a library that's existed forever. But the concept is actually, I think, a concept that is used across multiple platforms. I think on iOS there's a similar thing, and like on the back end, I'm sure there's a similar thing. And the idea with you use Timber as well, right? I'm presuming.
Yes. Yeah. Totally.
Right. So, which is why, like, usually in an Android application, when I'm working with a mobile application, I'm never directly logging. I never use like the base log call. I send everything through Timber.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know, Timber is like this open source library that Jake wrote. Uh, and the idea is it's a collection service. I mean, the name is kind of a cute name. And the way it works is the Timber library, you send everything into Timber. So, like, say you would use a log call, log.d or log.debug, and all these things. You would instead be using timber.debug, timber.e, timber.v. That's how you would use it.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you would configure Timber is you would basically plant these classes, and these classes, because you're planting them, they're called trees, right? So you plant these tree instances. And so what you can do is when you're setting up your application, when you're setting up Timber, you can say, oh, depending on certain conditions, I'm planting these different trees. And if I open up my application here, right, like we have like a bajillion like kind of combinations. So in my main application class, uh, if it is like a production instance, then like these streaming services, right, I plant one of those trees. So I plant a Datadog tree, I plant a log DNA tree, and that's how, and you write these custom trees. They're just like simple classes where in these classes, you're essentially delegating how you want to handle these calls. So if I open up one of these trees, I basically look at the priority level, and based on the priority level, I do different things, right? So for the log DNA, the streaming stuff, if it's a log.verbose, I just ignore it. Like I don't even send it up.
Okay.
Right. So that's one aspect. So within the tree itself, you can manage what happens to these logs. But stepping back, also like what I was talking about, you plant these trees under different conditions, right? For example, when you use these things like log DNA and like these third-party services that we talked about, I mean, they're paid services, right? And they can land up being super expensive if you just always log things in there.
Yeah.
So when we're on like debug builds, like for developers, when we're like, I actually don't log any of those things because usually when you're working on a debug build, you have access to the device, right? So you can just stream the logs on Logcat and see all of these things.
Yeah.
So in those cases, I just basically don't send it. I don't plant these specific trees. I also, we talked about like warning and error. So because of that, I also have a Crashlytics tree.
Yeah.
So that's something I plant in, right? And there, like if it's a warning, I send that as like I log that as an exception. There's like, and Crashlytics also has like these things called breadcrumbs, or like, you can send log messages. So I also like send in those breadcrumbs in there. Like, so info, verbose, info and debug, I send those also with my log, with my crash. So, and the way it works is when the crash gets uploaded to Crashlytics, you'll see some of these logs go in, right? So the beauty with this is it just abstracts all of your logging. So all I have to deal with when I'm building a feature is using Timber, right? And I just trust that the way I have Timber wired up, at when my application is created, it just does the right thing, right? It makes sure that I'm sending the necessary logs to the right services at the right time.
Yeah.
Do you think that's like a decent roundup of what Timber is?
Yeah. I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it. It's just, it's an abstraction that allows you to provide various different implementations of how you want to handle the logs. And it's super powerful. I do the same thing. I created a Crashlytics, tree many, many years ago that it's, now it's Firebase or whatever the heck that's turning into.
Right. Do you still call it Crashlytics tree as well?
Yeah, it's probably still, I know it's in many code bases, probably still that way. For those not familiar with Crashlytics, that's what part of Firebase used to be called back in the day. What's called Crashlytics. That was the crash reporting tool that was free at the time, which is why we reference it that way. But no, I completely agree. It's very powerful, and it's one of those tools and libraries that I install probably very early on in every single project. Like, oh, need Timber. Because I'm so used to typing Timber, I don't ever type log.d or whatever. And the nice thing about Timber too is it automatically will create the tags for you. Like you don't have to provide a tag; it'll just generate one for you based upon the file and so forth, which is nice,
Yeah. I think the idea there's like they have there's a base tree called Debug tree that actually I think parses out the tag, and that's like the beauty. Like that's one really helpful thing. So these trees that we're talking about, if you extend, if you extend Debug tree, which is one, there it automatically figures out the tag. So all you have to do is just timber dot something.
You're right. Yes.
If I think if you use the traditional log service on Android, you also have to specify a tag for everything, right? So this makes it really convenient. And I mean, obviously, you can also override these things. For example, sometimes when I'm working on a specific feature and I want to, filter out based on a specific tag. For example, I was building this feature and like it happens to span multiple screens, but I want to trace the logs in one shot, right? So I would tag them all with the same thing. So you can also override those messages. So if I'm making like, if I land on a screen and with the whole MBI stuff, like if I have like different logging happening, I want to see across multiple screens the same log. So I tag them with that and you can filter based on these tags. So that's that's one aspect.
Yeah, it's super nice. So doing that, then you're able to, in a production build, you have overridden the D call for debug, and then you're just probably using, if it's Datadog or if it's Logly or whatever your logging service is, you're then just calling their library and saying, hey, here, stream this log up here. And then if it's perhaps maybe if it's verbose, you might just say, this is a production build, ignore that. So just no op it, right?
Yep, exactly. That's exactly how I would use
And
it.
if you folks who don't know what no op, no-op, no operation means, that we're not, when that function is called, we're not doing any operation. It's basically just an empty function body, empty implementation. So your code is still calling timber.v for verbose, and you're still passing a message in or whatever. So the work to build that message is still being done, but you're just not logging it to any service, to the console, to nothing. It's just basically going to an empty method that does nothing. And the reason for that is, production, maybe you don't want to do anything with the verbose logs for whatever reason, so you just don't log them to anywhere.
I had a quick question. So I know, like on iOS, they have like a similar kind of thing that they've written on the back end. Like when you work on like Node applications, or like even like for cats.io, like do you also use similar kind of concepts? Like do you abstract your logging away, or do you just use the like basic logging thing?
No, I abstract it away behind a library usually. It depends on what language it is. So if it's in like Node, there's like Winston, and there's tons of them. The same thing with Ruby. Depends on which app I have. I've used different ones, and I'll abstract it away. But then usually, almost always, especially for server side stuff, I'll abstract it away to a logging provider like Logly or Papertrail or one of those ones, so I can actually go get to those logs when something's going kind of crazy. Because most of the servers that I might run for various clients will sometimes run on Heroku, and that the logs on there are kind of limited. So I need somewhere to go get some historical perspective. If something's happening, then I need to be able to trace through it.
Oh, Papertrail. That's one I've used as well. That's the other service, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, yeah.
Yeah, I use it. I get daily emails from them about all the things I'm doing wrong.
It is like kind of interesting. There's so many of these services, right? Papertrail, Datadog, Logly, Logged In, and I'll try to throw like links in the show notes to all of these.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I had that I want to ask you is, do you sort of have a sense of when you want, because that's the common question, right? Like when should I be logging something and when should I not be logging something? Because excessive logging can also start to make these things noisy. Like even if you leave the expense side, even if you leave the expense aspect aside, do you have like some sort of like mechanism to know when you're going to log something versus when you're not going to log something?
It's kind of just for me. There's no like set in stone rule. It's kind of like, I hate to say it, kind of a gut feeling approach of
Instincts, right? For sure.
yeah, I'll be in there, and I'll be writing some code that makes sense at the time. And let me back this up and say, when do I always log? That's a good question. I always log any exceptions. I never swallow an exception. Don't do anything with it. That is like, never do this. Like, if you have an exception and it's in a try catch, even if you're expecting that exception to happen, I recommend doing something with it. Just log it as a warning, something, just so that you know that it happened inside of your logs, even if you don't send it somewhere. I know there'll be people who disagree with that for certain reasons. There's exceptions everywhere. That pun was not intended, by the way.
The funny thing is, I've actually done, and I'm speaking out of experience from what Don just said. I was one of those folks in the camp where I was like, some of this is useless. I can't act on this, just swallow it. And that was a bad idea. Trust me. It is just,
why was it a bad idea?
Well, because the thing is, you think at the moment that it isn't useful, but there's so many, it's the unknown unknowns, right? Like it's what you don't know. For example, there are times when this issue caused like an issue 3 or 4 screens ahead, right?
Yeah.
And when you're looking at the logs of those screens, like you have no idea that something went wrong like 3 steps before, right? For example, you make, and this again is a very hypothetical example, you make a network call and you expect a certain thing to be populated, right? But this network call failed and you decided like, what, timeout exception, there's nothing I can do about it, just like retry. If not, whatever, move on with your life, right? But then what will happen is 4 screens later, you would expect maybe this call to have gone through and populated a certain data, or populated some data. Now, obviously, again, people can say, oh, well, you can run checks. Yeah, I get all of that, right? my point is, I'm giving a hypothetical example where there are times when just knowing that something went wrong is very useful, right?
Yeah.
And a common way that this was done is, I think, with RX, you can set like an on error handler, right? The thinking, and forget like, nothing you can do about it. I know like a well meaning developer once came in and added this thing in our like code base where they're like, look, I never want the app to crash for the user because that's a jarring experience. That's a terrible experience. So even if RX decides to like crash and we have not handled the on error call, I don't want this to like cause problems. So I'm just going to swallow the exception, right? And you can do this. Like RX allows you to do this. I don't recommend that. Like, we eventually changed it, but then the problem with there is like we couldn't just say, okay, you know what, next release I'm changing this, because then there are so many places where
Yeah.
we didn't land up handling the crash that the app would just keep constantly crashing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until we ironed out every single part of the code base. And if your code base starts to become massive, it's really hard to like track these down.
Yeah.
So then what we did is then we changed that to just warn, but then like the problem is you've like lost your grouping because you're like logging everything from one place. It just, until we could like untangle ourselves from that place, it got to be pretty messy. So it doesn't hurt to just log it, right?
Yeah.
And a good question to ask is, why wouldn't you want to log that, right? Is it a cost reason? If it's a cost reason, then maybe you should figure out something else, right? Like, for example, Crashlytics and a lot of these things, I think like Crashlytics is like Firebase is still like free,
Yeah.
right? Quote unquote
Yeah.
free. Sometimes I would argue you can actually use paid services and like get better. Like, yeah, but I mean that's a different argument. I don't want to like bring that in. But
True.
there are free services that allow you to kind of handle this stuff. So yeah, I'm totally with you. Like warning, especially warning an error, it's always good to know that happened.
Yeah.
I can't like imagine a world where you can like decide not to act on it. That's different. For example, timeout exceptions, if the user was in an area where there's network, like bad network reception, it's still useful to know that happened, right? Even if you can't act on it.
Yeah, it's kind of, and there are some weird libraries too that will throw weird errors. Like I did actually swallow one error, I think within the last couple of years, and I felt very guilty of it, and I had tons of comments around why it was happening. And it was a error from Google Phone Lib. Have you ever used that before?
Oh, interesting.
It's their phone number library that helps with like formatting phone numbers and parsing phone numbers, and like it's very robust, and you can use it on iPhone and iOS because it's basically C under the hood. But what ends up happening is if you pass a phone number in, and for some reason I think it's is valid phone number or something like this, or you parse something, if it's not parsable, it just throws an exception, and it's like. It was like a very valid like flow. Like, all right, if this is not parsable, I need to show an error, or something like that. And it just would throw an exception. So you had to like catch that exception, some parse exception, and then you had to do something. And so it was one of those times where I swallowed it and then updated the error message or whatever. And that was the one weird case. But even then, I think might have actually came back and still put a log back in later because we were just trying to be very cohesive and end to end with what we were doing. But to kind of bring this full circle, one of the main reasons, and here's a very recent example, there was a exception that was swallowed in the application. Couldn't figure out what was going on in the flow of it. We had this weird bug, couldn't replicate it. And finally, I saw it was being swallowed. It didn't look like it had anything to do with it. I said, well, you know what? I don't want to swallow errors. Let me just log this and I'll just kind of commit this with the bug fix. It'll 2-in-1, and I'll kill two birds with one stone. And I logged this error message. It was like some file exception thing or whatever we were swallowing. And as soon as I did that, it actually helped me fix the bug. And the reason why is because as soon as I logged the exception was caught because if we couldn't create a file, then we were to do something else. Well, little did I know the reason why the file couldn't be created was because of a permissions issue. And because of that weird permissions issue that happened, we weren't able to actually do something further down the line, not because of what we originally thought the reason why we couldn't create the file. Maybe it already existed or something like that. And so I all of a sudden realized, like, oh, we have a permissions issue. That's the whole problem with this. Like we had moved some files around, moved some paths around, and now the permissions are wrong. And I didn't know that and would have never known that unless I turned on that, that logging for that one exception. So it's just weird. You can get these weird side effects from logging exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's just information, right? Like knowing as
Yeah.
much information as you can, like lands up helping. It's funny, like I think I briefly mentioned this with Crashlytics. They have like the breadcrumbs thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Even rollbar that we've used before. So we have a rollbar tree as well with Timber. They also have it is super useful when you look at a crash or you look at like a non-fatal error or you look at like one of these issues and you see like a trace of what has happened. It just makes it so much more easier, right? You can say, oh, they went from this screen to that screen and
Hmm.
then something happened here, right? It's just really valuable information. So
One of the things that these logging tools like Crashlytics, Firebase, etc., all of them out there allow you to do stuff like this, is you can also add keys to your like logging environment. And so what that means is like you're going to start up like Crashlytics or my favorite logging service, and then when you start it up, you can actually say, hey, by the way, I want to set this key for this session. And what you can do is and this is something that this is kind of back when we first started talking before we started the podcast. How we started talking was from my talk about Android from the trenches. Is one of the things that I did is I would take the git hash, the SHA, and I would put that as the key inside of the Crashlytics session. So anytime I received a crash, I then could say, all right, what version of this was it for my application? And I can actually just go look at that key and say, oh, this is from this particular git hash. This is the production version that actually shipped. So I actually go right into my Git repository and actually check out that exact version back. All right, now let me reproduce this problem. Oh, here it is, because maybe it was fixed three versions from out, or that file is moved and it's too hard to trace now. But then at that point, I can go back and find it.
oh, that's like a brilliant suggestion. I think so. This just to confirm, this is different from just what you send in that log. With every log, you can also like attach some helpful information, right? Like the version number, git
Yeah,
hash, device. And I think a lot of these services automatically update useful information for you now these days, so you don't actually have to manually attach them. But things that only you would know, right? Like for example, user ID or some identifying information, so you know where this came from.
that's a good point too. I mean, let me backtrack to an original question of like what things am I logging and when do I choose to log each one of them. I always log exceptions. So if it's a unplanned exception, I'll log it. So log dot error. If it's something I expect is going to happen, but it's an exception, I will do a warning for it. Information I'll kind of use sporadically here and there. If it's something that I feel that it has some importance, that's more important than debugging. Uh, when do I log debug? I'll usually only start providing a lot of debug logs if I'm finding the code hard to trace. Then I'll actually start adding a lot of debug logs. And I might say parameters for this, parameters for that. And then I can actually start seeing the natural order of kind of the calls that are happening. This happens a lot in a lot of asynchronous code. Like, all right, this is calling this is calling this. When is this happening? When is that happening? And if I start putting all those into debug logs, then I can actually see what's happening. And verbose is just for, like you said, it's like very generalized information. Like, all right, this screen was shown, this view is closing down. And I'll only use those if it's something that, again, seems to be problematic inside of the app, but I don't want to include inside of a debug log for whatever reason. That's kind of a case by case basis. There's no heuristic for that.
Yeah. I want to talk about one feature that we built that's similar, because like a big aspect of this is if you don't want to send all the logs, sometimes you do want the logs, right? Uh, so what we did was, so we have like in-app support in the app. So like users can call and say, hey, I'm running into some issues, right? So what we do is sometimes like we also actually, if you have like this flag turned on, we log all of the verbose logs, but we don't stream it for privacy reasons. Obviously, we don't stream it outside, but we save it onto the local device, and it's protected inside the app, sandboxed or whatever the term is, where basically it's you can't get direct access unless you're like from within the app. So we log this into a file, and if they report an issue, then we upload everything. And this lands up being very useful, especially if we have like users who are like, hey, I'm just constantly running to this device. I'm using like this LG Stylo 4 device that nobody's heard of. And it's just when I run into like a barcode scanning issue, like things just break. I can't use this, right? And we're like, it might be impossible to get a hold of that device in time. Or, sometimes we're like, you know what? If I knew what the user went through or like what are the different logs that are seen, then this would make it much more useful. So we actually built a feature where like when anyone calls in for like in-app support and they have this flag turned on, then the logs typically, which we would ignore, we would just write them to a local file. And this is obviously like within the sandbox. And we would upload from that to the ticket, the actual ticket that they called into. Like, because eventually when like a support agent like calls, this information will be like directly uploaded. So when they forward that ticket to the engineers, like we can actually like just look at the logs.
Nice.
So that lands up being super useful. Uh, with this, I'll also add the caveat that you have to do this very carefully because, again, we never want to log sensitive information in this. So this is where like Timberlands are being useful. So what we did is we overrode some of those calls and we run through multiple filters. So like we make sure that like we strip out all like any personal information, phone number, blah blah, all that is like completely removed, right? Because obviously, like in these cases, given how, and this is a good thing I feel, we given like GDPR, like CPA, CCPA, or whatever it's called, a lot of these, a lot of countries now have enacted rules where you're not allowed to, if you hold this information from a user, you're expected to like give this information back. So and I think this is like that makes perfect sense in my opinion, right? Like it does add a lot of more. It adds the burden onto developers so that like if you're capturing information, then you have to be good about releasing that information. And again, you should be able to purge this information if a user like explicitly requests it. So a lot of like GDPR expects a lot of this functionality to exist. So I will throw this two caveats. Just like logging is extremely useful, but just because it's useful, don't think you can just log everything, right? Because it can come back and bite you in the ass. You want to make sure that you don't overlog as well. Sometimes it's just like, oh, it's useful, so I just throw that in anyway. Like, no, it doesn't work like that. Sometimes you want to be careful about what you're logging, because if you're expected to also like clean up and do a lot of these things and then provide functionality so that you can like surface the logs back to the user, then you have to build in a lot of this.
It's a lot of stuff to build, man.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It can get really difficult. Like the burden's on you as a developer or like the maintainer of the service. So also think twice. Maybe sometimes you don't need all that information. And from like personal experience, we've found that like, all you care about is like sometimes just like the technical aspects, right? Like this screen, this activity was shown, you don't need more than that. So it is worth also keeping that in mind. Don't overlog, because then that can cause problems later on.
Yeah, it can. I think, one of the things that's, this has always been a challenge for everybody out there is like, how do you trace something end to end? And I know that there have been, I think Rollbar does this. You have more experience with this than I do, I think. But Rollbar does this from a perspective that on a client, I can perform some logs, and then I can also be using maybe perhaps that same service on the back end, and I can actually be able to see where that request is basically originating at the client, going all the way through the server. Is that something that you've dealt with? And then how would you recommend someone who's new to this implementing something like that in a safe manner?
Oh, absolutely. So, and I think there was a previous episode, I don't remember, that I talked about this.
Yeah, I think so.
It's like X request ID. It's like cross like request ID. So typically, and what can happen here, right, is like sometimes, and you explained it really well. Sometimes you want to trace a request from the point of origin all the way to your different servers and then like back as a response, right?
Yep.
So what you can do is from the client side, in network requests, you can attach an extra header. And I think there are different versions, but I think the standard now is like X-request-ID.
Okay.
And so, yeah, and I'll make sure to like add the episode where I talk in like detail about this. But the idea here is, especially with bigger apps and services these days, it's not as simple as just client hit server response, right? Because there's an Nginx server that comes in between. There's a load balancer, and then from the load balancer, it sends it to your application server. You might have like different like levels of sharding that are happening there. So you don't know which server is like hitting this thing. It like formulates a response that comes back from a response, and then like you get the response on the client, right? So if you attach this request, a lot of these services actually, like for example, I know Rails does this by default. If you associate an X request ID with your network request, it actually persists this and maintains this. So it, as it performs the network request and does various things, when it serves it back as a response, it'll give the same X request ID. You typically send a UUID in these things. So what happens is in this service that you're like assuming like your backend, your mobile clients all use the same service. For example, you can use something like Datadog or one of these other services, Logly, and like there are plenty of other services, right? You can simply paste that request ID, and then you can literally track this request as it originates from the client. It hits your load balancer. Your load balancer, it hits your application server. You can see exactly what happens. And that can land up being super useful. So this is like one of those things that's a standard.
Standard way to do it with the X request ID.
Yeah, yeah. Especially when for this is like specifically if we want to trace network requests and like see how like logs, how like how requests transform from the point of origin from the client to the backend and come back. If you want to see like, hey, what does that network? What happens in that network request? Right?
Yeah.
Did it 401? Did it get retried? Did it like eventually come up successful with the 200 response code? Yeah, this X request ID is a good way to do that specific aspect.
Yeah, there's a good article actually that we can link to. It's actually on Heroku's website. It's called the HTTP request IDs, and they kind of show you how it works. With logs, how you can use it with Rails, Node.js, Django, Java, PHP, Scala, Clojure. They have a whole bunch here. So we'll provide a link to that so you can kind of get some more information. I think it'd be a good way to dive into it. So if you're looking to trace from end to end, it looks like X request ID is going to be your friend here.
What else? Is there anything else that you've learned from your time, like logging? Any like lessons that you've learned, things that you want to like, pass on?
Again, the only thing I can really say is that, this is the one that I'm just going to stick with. If you have an exception, just log it. If even if it's caught, log it as a warning or something. It could end up helping you out in the future. It's going to be one of those times when you don't log it, when it kind of comes back to bite you in the butt.
Very true. Very true. And I think like the biggest question that most people again have is like, oh, what should I log in what level? In the end, like, you'll land up knowing what works for you. This is what works for both Don and me, like, the different levels that we talked about. Crash, warning, error warning, verbose, info, debug. These are pretty standard. And if you pick one, I think maybe you just start off with the ones we mentioned. And that usually works pretty well. But you learn to like tweak these as like, depending on your specific use case.
Do you find yourself sticking to one particular log? And the reason why I ask this is because I'd probably say I spend 80% of my time in the debug log, and then I'll pop over to warning and error, and then occasionally into info. I rarely use verbose. Do you have a certain like area you feel more like that's where you just naturally gravitate towards?
Oh, it's interesting. For me, it's actually verbose. So
Okay.
I default to like verbose because I don't want those. Verbose, I usually feel as I'm building a feature or building a service, like verbose is things that I think will be helpful for me, but I don't want it logged.
That's what you don't want it logged back to the server, right? Because you stream debug, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I stream debug.
Right,
I don't stream verbose. So that's why I prefer to like be in the land of verbose, so I don't mistakenly send things that I shouldn't be sending.
Mm-hmm.
Debug is when I'm like very specifically. I spend time in debug when I have a new feature. I'm like not sure how this is working. For example, with the whole like new unidirectional stateflow MVI stuff, right? Like the view state and events. My events, I log those as debug when I'm starting out as a feature, because then I can literally see how a screen is being used, right?
Yeah.
This event was sent in, and that was a view state that was sent out back. When I'm not sure if a feature is stable, that ends up being super useful.
Mm-hmm.
But once it's stable, I quickly switch that from debug to verbose, and that just is easy because then this feature that I talked about, where like the verbose gets sent if they log a ticket, then that like I have that information if I need it, but it doesn't it doesn't get sent, it doesn't get streamed regularly. So I usually find myself working on verbose. Debug is those special circumstances where I've released it, it's in the Play Store, it's rolling out to 10%. I just want to see how things are going. I'd like open up the stream service, like filter out the tag and then see just like all the debug messages, and I was like, oh, that looks okay. I was like, whoa, I didn't expect that to happen. So I can go back quickly, change things, and after like it's rolled out to 100% for a week or two, I feel comfortable like, okay, this thing is working as it should. Then I'll go back, throw up a PR and like change all those to verbose.
It's not a bad idea. I think my experience is I haven't worked with a lot of clients that do a lot of streaming for debug. But then I think that's also, that's another question that might pop up from this is like, all right, should I be streaming my debug logs? And is there any best practices for that. But that could be a whole other
Yeah.
chat about, DevOps for apps in itself that we'll
Oh
probably
yeah.
have to have here in the future.
Oh, and that's a great question. I will like say one thing: if you can avoid having that, avoid it. Especially with things that like the way like the privacy and stuff works on. Like if you don't need this, don't use it. For example, we have like our shopper side and we have a customer side. On the customer side, also like we don't even have half these logs because we don't even want them.
Yeah.
And the release cycle is a little slower, right? But like in some of the apps that we work, our release cycles, we work very closely with these shoppers. They're like our partners.
Mm-hmm.
So we know like, there's like a mutual understanding. So like we want to iterate really fast. So that's why it lands up being useful. I would say if you can avoid having, logging these matches, just avoid it altogether. Like the verbose thing, if you can just get it sent up, that works beautifully well, So like we've drastically reduced a lot of our logging services, especially with a lot of GDPR and a lot of these things coming to fruition. We just minimize as much as you can.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's our hard thing about the privacy stuff is what can you be sending to these remote places? And you said before, like if you're gonna collect some data, then you have to be able to provide it back to them. So that's something you have to keep in mind is like as a developer, if you're logging something, ask yourself the question of like, would I want, would the person of all of your friends, let's use this question because some people don't care. If of all of your friends, we all have that one friend who's like security conscious, like conspiracy theorist. They think like everything was like the moon is fake, like those kind of people.
Okay.
Like, flat earth, whatever. But with the whole other
moon landing didn't happen.
Exactly. But think of that person. Would they want their data that you're about to log, that data you're logging, would they be okay with that being logged? If not, then that's something you might want to rethink logging in or check with, your product owners or something like that. Say, hey, is this something we can be logging? Because it may end up being a compliance issue later down the line. It could end up being a huge ball of wax to untangle.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Right. PII, personal identifiable information, right?
PII.
If you can identify a person with that information, you should probably not be logging it at all, but if you're logging, if, this activity was shown, I think that's fine. But again, like you summed it up pretty well. If in doubt, ask someone who knows this pretty well,
And so for those of you wondering, just for a real quick recap if you're wondering, is this something that's PII, which is personal identifiable information? What should I not be logging? So things like full name, country, state, gender, race, your email address, home address, social security number, passport numbers, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers, date of birth,
phone numbers,
telephone numbers, login details, anything that I just mentioned like that, you probably shouldn't be logging at all.
Yeah, and as a developer, I don't see why you would want that either, right? There's no reason you would need that to like help with your application, at least a majority of most applications that we use.
No, not at all. I mean, you guys can send me all the donations you want for PayPal. I'll put that link on the show notes and I will share it with Kaushik. And but that's a different topic. Just kidding. But that's anyway. I think that kind of wraps us up for today's show on everything logging.
And yeah, if folks have suggestions, comments, or things that they've run into, issues that they have with logging, feel free to shoot that to us. Like because I think we've been through some apps and we've gone through different logging strategies, so it'll always be interesting to see if we can like help answer some of those.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for your logging discussion and wisdom, Don.
Thank you, Kaushik.
I was trying to think of like a funny pun, but then none of those like seemed.
None of them really logged out that well.
All right.
That's it, folks. We're logging off.
You're killing me. I want to take this chance and also thank Square for sponsoring today's show. You can build with their in-app payments SDK for Android in a secure way. If you're a mobile app and you want to basically just take payments, then you should definitely check their SDK out. For a nice tutorial on how to use this SDK, head on over to youtube.com/Square. Thanks again for sponsoring today's show, Square. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.